In this video, Alec Tucker from Ubiquitek App Studio is going to talk to us all about the MVVM pattern. MVVM is an architectural pattern that helps you build solid .NET MAUI apps that's going to let you write code that will be maintainable and you'll be able to work on comfortably from years to come. If you want to build enterprise apps, this is the way to go. Check out his talk and let us know what you think.
So my name is Alec Tucker, for those that don't know me. I don't have a who am I about me slide at the start like everyone else. I'm not into motorbikes. I did do my open water one scuba diving years ago, and I play guitar, so I'm perhaps half as cool as the previous speakers. I run a company called Ubiquitek, originally founded as an app development studio. We've since branched out into some more generic Microsoft 365 and Dynamics implementations. And I'm also CTO of an exciting new fintech startup called NewQuantum. That's my Twitter handle if you like what I say and you want to hear some more. So we've talked a bit about MVVM, or we've touched upon it. So I'm going to dive into it now, but I'll cover some of the basics first and then talk about what MAUI is bringing to the party to make things easier for us. So we had, like I say, a brief high-level view of this earlier. So the MVVM is model, view, model. It trips off the tongue very nicely. The view, as we've covered, is how to display information. This is the user interface. What does the screen look like? We'll then have the view model. That controls what to display. It tells the view what to display. It provides the data. And underneath the covers a little bit further, we've then got the model. I actually have more business logic in the view models and just tend to have the models as plain old C# objects with not much in them at all. Yeah, if you put too much in there, you can get unstuck quite quickly. But you'll see interesting here is the data back and forth in between these and events. So that's really where the framework comes into play. So as I say, MVVM is it's an architecture to help with separation of concerns. Lots of good reasons to go that route, one of which is testability. If you've got your business logic separated from your UI, you can then do some useful testing on it. Now, your view, as we've covered already, can be C#, can be XAML. We've seen quite a bit about the controls and layouts in there. The view doesn't know where data comes from, doesn't care where data comes from. So yeah, the view model will tell the view what to display, as we've talked about, and that communication happens through data binding. When things change in the view, it will send the notification to the view. And this is one of the kind of the nuggets, I guess, of this binding. When something changes in the view model, it notifies the view that something has changed. That then tells the view to request the new value from the view model. So there are kind of two bits of communication there. And the core of that is I notify property changed. So what you're looking at here is what I'll call the longhand version. You wouldn't put this in every view model, but that's what this example is showing. Putting into a view model an implementation of INotify property changed, which creates an on property changed method that links to that property changed event handler. So whenever a property value changes, with this code in place, we can call the on property changed method, and that will raise that event, which sends the notification to the UI that will then request the new value of that property. And here's that in action. Subtle plug there for Matt's book. So you can see here in the definition of the property here, we've got the private backing variable and the public property. And in the setter, where we assign the new value to the property, we then call onPropertyChanged. Now, a couple of things to notice here. The first one is, the first thing we do is check whether or not the property has actually changed. Because we're raising an event, we're sending out that notification. We don't want unnecessary notifications flying around, depending on how complex the user interface gets. So we make sure that we only send out that notification if the property has actually changed. And then we're calling onPropertyChanged and passing in the name of the property. Now, the better coders among you will be looking at that and thinking, oh, I don't want a string in my code like that. And we'll look at some better examples, some better ways of doing that. Yeah, here's what that binding would look like if you're creating the binding in C#. Here's a slightly more complex example of the binding. So here we're binding to the text property of an entry control. Now, because the value of the text property of an entry control can be changed by the user, or it can be changed by something in the underlying code, that binding needs to be two-way. So you can see here we're specifying two-way binding, a binding mode of two-way. I'll talk a bit more about defaults there, but first, you can see here we've got a significantly better way of specifying the control that we're binding to, or the property, sorry, that we're binding to, rather than just putting the name in text. We can do it in this way and get some IntelliSense, get some compile time checking that we haven't misspelt that, and we're going to get a problem at runtime. So I mentioned default binding modes. Each property has, each control property has a default binding mode, and this is one place where, or one of many places now, where Microsoft documentation is really good. It'll tell you what all the defaults are, and in general, it'll default to the right thing. So for example, the binding mode for the text property on a label is one way. You're only going to change that from your code. The user can't change it, usually. For an entry, that will default to two-way because the communication needs to be two-way. So we actually don't need to specify that mode equals two-way there because it is the default. Oh, jumped forwards too early there. So in this binding, we can get fancy here. There are a number of other things that we can use that I'm not going to dive into here, but this is where we can use things like converters, value converters, string formats, multiple bindings and spans to bind to different things for the same property, despite the same text property on that label, for example. So once this binding is in place, the label now knows that there is a property in the binding context, which will be the view model, called first name, that this will be bound to. And provided we specify things correctly, these bindings are compiled and optimized. So that covers properties, binding of properties, and we'll dive into some code to look at how that's implemented in a moment. But the other thing we'll look at for binding is events. So how can events triggered by the user be communicated to your view models through binding? So most of you will know that UI raises events like this. This is kind of the 101 for event handling. The code goes in the code behind file, and you can write your code in there to respond to whatever the user's just done. So as far as this architecture is concerned, at least, that's a downside now, putting that code in the code behind. As a rule of thumb, when you're adopting this approach, as was mentioned earlier, it's not necessary that you will apply a draconian approach and say there must never be any code in the code behind file. But the code in the code behind should be specific to the user interface. So things like scale to, translate to that Kim was talking about just now, they obviously have to go in the code behind because they are pertinent to the UI, not so pertinent to the business logic behind the scenes. And this also is one of the contributing things to that separation of concerns. The code that you run in response to a user taking action is code that should sit in isolation from the user interface and be able to be tested in isolation of the user interface. So we achieve this using the ICommand interface, which, as we see here, is effectively an abstraction for these user interface events and the methods that get called behind them. So when we implement the ICommand interface, we have a command and we have these three elements of it. We have can execute. Well, I'll just talk about can execute and execute initially. So execute is where you specify the method that you want to run when this command is triggered. Can execute will return a Boolean value, defaults to true. So if you don't implement can execute, it will return true. The method specified in the execute property of the command will only be executed if can execute returns true. So you can write code in your can execute method that specifies whether or not the user should be able to trigger that command. And depending on what control you've got the command linked to, just specifying that can execute method will automatically impact whether or not that control is enabled or disabled. So if you've got a button, for example, if can execute returns false, the button will be disabled, with one caveat. And this is very similar to needing to call onProperty changed in the property setter to have the same impact as to trigger that notification back to the user interface. If you change anything that will impact the results of your can execute event, then you need to trigger the can execute changed event, like in the same way as that notified property changed event. So for example, if you've got a login screen and you only want to enable the login button if the text of the username is not empty and the text of the password is not empty, then anywhere you've got the, if you're setting that property and you're triggering a notification change for that setter, there you would put, you would trigger can execute changed as well to make sure that the UI can update itself based on the results of that. That we've already covered. So yeah, this is what I was just running through. Yeah. So again, we've looked already at a number of the controls provided in MAUI. Look here at menus, buttons, various different types. But MAUI has already put in place a certain amount of this command property framework. So for example, a button will have a command property and that supports binding. So you would then bind that to the command that you've created in your ViewModel. I would typically be adopting some slightly more specific coding standards. And I would usually have command bound to a thing called do give bonus command. And the reason for making that a bit longer is because that would then call a method called give bonus. So it just gives that like a bit more separation there and a bit of consistency throughout your code. Now you can see here as well as the command property, there's also a command parameter property, and you can put things in here that will be passed into the command, into that executes, the method specified by the execute property as parameters into that method. And here you can see just a string, hard-coded string being passed in, but that parameter also supports binding, so you can pass things in that way. The XAML here is also showing how you can bind to commands and add this behavior for controls that don't have a command property out of the box. So an image, for example, here doesn't have a command property, but we can simply add a gesture recognizer, specify that it's a tap gesture recognizer, and that tap gesture recognizer has the command property and the command parameter property that we can use. And again, so this is an example of that in action. So we specify a public ICommand. I heard something. I'm just hoping that not my battery going low. Looks like we're good. So yeah, we're specifying a public ICommand called give bonus. And We're setting that up as a new command in the constructor of the ViewModel. And there we specify the method to be called when the command is executed, followed by the method to be called to determine whether or not the command can be executed. Then the actual code that gets executed when that command is triggered goes in this onGiveBonus method. So all this wiring kind of basically ties the user event right through to this onGiveBonus method and the onCanGiveBonus method. Now, as I mentioned just now, and as we've seen in some of the previous talks, if we specify a data type on the page or at various other places, we can also do this. I would typically do it on the page and have one page associated with one view model wherever possible. If you specify the data type and you specify that as the corresponding view model, just putting that in place enables compile time bindings and optimizations. So the bindings will be compiled. You'll get very nice IntelliSense support in your XAML, not just in your code. And that is a massive boon. You don't want to be trying to narrow down where you've made a slight typo in the name of something in your XAML. This is a much better approach. So now I'm going to jump out of this and take a look at some code and what that looks like. So let's hide those. So to start with, well, when all that's in place that we've just walked through, things hang together nicely, things work together very nicely, your code is nice and testable and compartmentalized. But how do we actually put all that in place? And what does .NET MAUI bring to the party to make that easier for us? So in this example here, if I just collapse a few things that we're not looking at just yet, you can see I've got 3 view model classes. We've got a monkeys view model, a monkey detail. Oh, thank you for that. Stop the share and share the right thing. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, we've got monkeys view model, monkey details view model, and a base view model. Those main 2 view models correspond to the 2 pages that we've got in here as views, but we'll start off looking at the base view model. So how do we put in what I was just talking about? So the first thing we need to do is get this to implement iNotify property changed. And let Visual Studio implement the interface for us. And that just puts that event handler there. And now if we add in public void on, whoops, something like live typing, property changed, string name. And again, let Visual Studio fill that in for us. So this is some nice features of Visual Studio 2022. We saw some similar things in Rider just now. Yeah, so this just puts the code in nicely for us, including checking that that's not null before trying to invoke something. But you can see here we've got the name passed in of the property that's being changed. Okay, so the next thing I will do is just add into the base view model some common properties that we'll want in all our view models. So if I say public pool is busy, some of you might be thinking there are better ways of doing this, perhaps using visual states, and you'd be right, but this is a nice way of just demonstrating this. So let's let Visual Studio write some code for us. Actually, I can make that a bit simpler in a moment. So this can just do oops, is busy. And then in the setter, of course, I've forgotten to do this one. And now in the setter, first thing is to do if is busy equals value. Oops. If I just slow down a bit, Visual Studio would write most of this for me. Very nice. Okay. And then finally, on property changed is busy. So that's now implementing everything that we've just talked about. We can then bind an activity indicator to this is busy property, and it will be available in all our view models because we put this into the base view model. A couple of things that we can do in here to get rid of this. We can say name of is busy. Oops. So I didn't need that bracket. So that then prevents us from making any typos. But there is one other thing to improve that a bit further. I can come back to here. Oops. If I can just add in here and having a mental blank of what to type here. I'm sure someone will shout it out in a minute. That's the one. Thanks, Matt. Let's make sure what we've got for what we need for that. I have to put a default value as well for that, I think, right? Yep. Yeah. So what that now does is at compile time, it will work out the name of the property that is calling this, which means down here, I just don't need to pass that name in at all, which is much better. That said, there are instances where we might still want to pass that name in. So if I say private bool is not busy, and then, whoops. Private bool is not busy. No, I don't need to set it there. So now we've got a property, and again, yes, there are better ways to actually do what this looks like it's designed to do. But we've got a property where we are basing the return value of this property on a different property. Now that will be great. If we query is not busy, we'll get the opposite of is busy. But it does mean that whenever the underlying value of is busy changes, we've got to tell the UI to re-query the value of is not busy as well. So that to do that, we would do on property changed. And here we can do name of is not busy. And that has achieved that. Okay, now we can follow the same approach to add whatever properties we need in those other view models to support the user interfaces that we've got. But the thing I want to show you, actually, I'll go and put one in, and then I'll show you that in here. So if we say in here, let's put in a private string title. Missed my semicolon again. And the same in here, if return else. It's like I'm used to a keyboard where the semicolon is somewhere else. So yep, title equals value, we'll have that, and we'll say on property changed. So that's all now in place. We've got a property that we can bind to. But what if that were easier? You can already see there'll be lots of repeated code in all your property definitions here. And there are lots of MVVM frameworks you can use. There are lots of helpers you can use to cut down on this. But some of that now comes built in to MAUI. So if I jump back to the base view model, and let's make some changes here. So if I get rid of that, and instead, I'll add an attribute outside the class, iNotify property changed. And I also need to make this partial because Visual Studio will be creating some code for me. So let's also do that. And you can see that I've deleted the onProperty changed method, but IntelliSense is telling me this is fine. That's because behind the scenes, that has been put in for us. So if I can go and try and have a look at that, under dependencies, let's have a look under Android and analyzers. And source generators. In there, with the iNotify property change generator, which has some generated code for us, partial class of the base view model. And not only has it put in everything that we had, there's the onProperty changed, and it's implemented that nicely for us. It also puts in quite a lot of other stuff that we can dive into and make use of. Yeah, a fair bit. So I'm not going to go into what all those other alternatives are now, but the nice thing there is we don't need to do our own implementation of iNotify property changed anymore. What we can then do is come back to the properties. So if I've just changed the base view model there. If I now come back to, where was it, Monkey's view model, what I can do here is change this to observable property. Now you can see here from the IntelliSense, there's an awful lot of inbuilt documentation. Now this is going to tell me what I've done wrong here. Whoops. Okay, so it probably means okay, there's something more that I've missed, but that's assume I've got it right, and that's basically as simple as that gets now. I'll just have a quick look through my notes, see if I can see what I've missed here. Something else? Property is observable property. Yeah, well, there must be something a little bit more. Any private version? Oh, yeah, I don't need these, do I? Okay, and that's an awful lot more straightforward, even easier when you've got the man who's written a book on it in the room. So that I can dive into the generated source code again and see exactly what's happened behind the scenes there. But that's just a good example of where .NET MAUI is just bringing a bit more to the party, just trying to make developers' lives easier. But in doing that, the nice thing for me looking at this is it just makes it more consistent. You'll get a lot of consistency through this. People who have used FODI weavers to achieve this in the past will recognize this, and there are further similarities. For example, to effectively raise notify property change, sorry, based on a different property. It's a very similar approach here to add another attribute to the property and specify that connection. For me, at least here, the fact that it's included, I say included, it's in the .NET Community Toolkit. But the fact that it's there in that common place, I think will bring in more consistency across the board, as opposed to in the past where I'd come across some projects that we'd take over maintenance of, and some of them would use FODI and some of them wouldn't. And more often than not, if somebody had used FODI, it was a bit of a secret highlight that they didn't quite understand what was going on with the whole property change notification mechanism and would reveal other things. I'm very hopeful that with this virtually being baked in, being in the toolkit, that will get a lot more consistency, and it won't effectively be that red flag anymore. So, like as I say, there is a lot more that could be dived into on MVVM. I think I'll stop there so that we can get into some coding, and then yeah, if anyone gets stuck on anything MVVM related, I'll be keeping an eye on the chats, and I'll open it up for questions. We've got one here in Sydney. Sure. That's a good question. So the question is, if we've got lots of properties in the view model all bound to the user interface, and one function in the view model that's changing them all, will it be re-rendering the UI for each of those changes? So it will, if you've only got it set up like this, yeah, it will send out a notification for each one of those changes, and the UI will make a separate request to the getter for each property one by one. Yeah, I don't know that you can get any efficiency there. I mean, if that's the only way that they're changing, you might have, and if you're not using this, you might have all your calls to unproperly changed in the one place in that function, but it would be more typically done like this, I think. I can see some things in the chat. Oh, okay. Remove get set. Yeah, I have more people telling me what I was doing wrong. That's awesome. Yeah, so I'm not seeing any more questions yet. So like I say, I'll hand over to Matt to close the presentations, and then I'll be around to answer questions if anyone gets stuck.
Thanks, Alec. That was awesome. Thank you for telling us all about MVVM there. If you would like some inspiration for some things that you can work on to get your hands on with .NET MAUI, put together some easy, medium, and challenging hacks that you could work on. So the first thing that you could do is a weather forecast app. And in fact, there's a really nice sample available on GitHub that's made by David Ortonell that I can, if anyone's interested in that, I can give you the link. Countdown timer is a nice kind of simple thing that you can make. If you're doing that, if you're using MVVM, you're going to be calling on property changed a lot with that one. So I'm sure Alec can help you with that. Intermediate, you could have a go at doing a weather forecast app, but link it to an online data source. So that's a slightly more challenging thing you could do. A real-time chat app, not as hard as it sounds. And in fact, Sam in his earlier presentation showed us one. So he gave us a link there to the code. I've actually got a sample of a chat app working as well using SignalR. So if anyone's interested in that, I can send you that sample as well. On the more challenging side, you could try doing a full stack to-do app, which is quite difficult. Actually, it's more difficult than it sounds. But I don't know because I've built one recently. A real-time location tracker, that's something else that you could do with .NET MAUI as well. So there's some options if anyone's interested. Some resources that might be helpful. Now I will put all of these links into the chat. In fact, I'll do it after. But there's a series of videos on SSW TV on our channel on YouTube with myself and Luke, who you can't see him, but he's the one that shouted out the question here in Sydney earlier. So we've got some videos up on YouTube where we talk about .NET MAUI, really good introductory resource there. In terms of, sorry, this one, awesome .NET MAUI, that's been shared. It's so good that it's been shared 3 or 4 times already today. Definitely well worth checking out. And then there was .NET MAUI UI July. So back in July of this year, every day throughout July, we got people to share some content on doing some UI stuff with .NET MAUI. A whole bunch of people that have done presentations today have got content on there as well. That's really worth checking out for some inspiration. The last resource I'm going to share with you is just a little bit of shameless self-promotion. As Alec mentioned earlier, and as a couple of other people mentioned, I'm actually writing a book on .NET MAUI. It's not out yet, it's not finished yet, but it's available in early access. So you can actually get the first 7 chapters. Chapter 7 just came out yesterday. You get the first 7 chapters and you get each chapter as it becomes available. And for people attending the hack day today here, I've got a discount code there. So if you follow that link and you put that code in, that QR code will take you to that link as well. But I will also drop the link in. That will give you 35% off the book, and that gives you the early access and the PDF and the Kindle or EPUB, whatever. It's DRM free.